1789, France's grain harvest failed by just 11%. Within 4 years, the monarchy was gone. But France wasn't the first, or the last, to ignore this pattern. What can history teach us today? 11%. That's the margin between stability and revolution. Here's what haunts historians. 3 other empires, spread across 3 continents and 3 centuries, got the exact same warning. Harvest failures, food price spikes, grain riots in the capital. All 3 had at least 15 years to respond. None of them survived. Mughal India, Habsburg Spain, Soviet Russia. Unrelated systems, different climates, separated by hundreds of years. Yet the pattern repeats with mechanical precision. Agricultural crisis, elite denial, cascading collapse. The question isn't whether empires fall, it's whether anyone recognizes the warning before it's too late. Look at the numbers, because what happened next wasn't random. Mughal India. Between 1702 and 1704, monsoon failures reduced grain yields across the Deccan Plateau by an estimated 40%. Within 18 years, the empire that controlled 1/4 of global GDP had fragmented into warring successor states. Habsburg Spain. From 1594 to 1598, repeated crop failures across Castile drove wheat prices up 300%. By 1610, Spain had declared bankruptcy for the 3rd time in 50 years and ceded effective control of the Netherlands. Soviet Russia. In 1975, the USSR produced 140 million tons of grain and had to import 15.5 million more. By 1984, imports hit 46 million tons annually. 7 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 3 empires, 3 agricultural crises, an average of 19 years from warning to collapse. And that's just the beginning. Because the real question is, why does food insecurity destroy empires faster than military defeat? Over the next 12 minutes, we're going to examine the identical pattern that preceded 3 of history's most dramatic collapses. We're going to track the exact timeline each empire had to respond, how long they ignored it, and when it became too late. The exact moment elites realized the crisis was real and why they couldn't act. And the cascading mechanism that transforms a harvest failure into total system breakdown. But here's what makes this urgent. By the end, you'll recognize which parts of this pattern are already active today, not as speculation, as documented, measurable fact. Every collapse has a story. Let's investigate. Because if the pattern holds, we're not watching history. We're watching a preview. Let's start in 1700. Mughal India under Emperor Aurangzeb controlled territory from Kabul to Madras, roughly 150 million people. The treasury collected 100 million rupees annually in land revenue alone. By any measure, this was the wealthiest state on earth, and it was completely dependent on rain. The Mughal system had one fatal flaw. Farmers paid taxes in cash, not crops. To get cash, they had to sell grain at market. The entire imperial administration, the armies, the bureaucracy, the court, ran on the assumption that harvests would be consistent enough to generate that cash flow. For most of the 17th century, they were. Then the monsoons failed. 1702. Across the Deccan Plateau and Gujarat, rainfall dropped below critical thresholds. Contemporary accounts describe wells drying up by March, 4 months before the next monsoon season. Grain prices in Surat doubled between February and June. 1703. The monsoon failed again. Now prices tripled. Aurangzeb's court chronicler, Kafi Khan, recorded peasants eating grass and tree bark in the countryside around Ahmednagar. 1704. 3rd year. Mortality estimates vary, but the most conservative figures put famine deaths at 2 million people across the Deccan alone. Aurangzeb knew. His officials sent reports. He reduced the land tax rate in affected districts by 25%. But here's the problem. Reducing taxes during a famine means less revenue exactly when the state needs more, to import grain, to maintain order, to keep the army fed. The Mughal Empire faced an impossible choice. Reduce taxes and starve the state, or maintain taxes and watch provinces revolt. They chose wrong. Or rather, They chose what every empire in this position chooses. They tried to maintain the system. By 1707, Aurangzeb was dead. Regional governors stopped sending revenue to Delhi. The Maratha Confederacy controlled the Deccan. The Persian Emperor Nader Shah sacked Delhi in 1739 and walked away with the peacock throne. From famine to fragmentation, 18 years. But the Mughals weren't the first empire to face this choice. A century earlier, Spain had already run the same experiment, with the same result. 1590. Habsburg Spain controlled an empire where the sun never set. Silver fleets from the Americas, territories across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Philip II commanded the most powerful military in the Western world. Then the weather changed. Climate historians call it the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped across Europe starting around 1550, and they stayed low for 3 centuries. But for Castilian peasants in the 1590s, it just meant the crops failed. 1594. Harvest failures across central Spain. Wheat prices in Madrid rose from 400 maravedis per fanega in January to 1,100 by December. That's a 175% increase in a single year. 1595. Worse. Prices hit 1,400. Plague broke out in Santander. Malnutrition makes populations vulnerable to disease. Mortality records from Castilian parishes show death rates doubling. 1596. The crisis spread to Andalusia, now food riots in Seville. The crown tried to impose price controls on grain. Merchants responded by hoarding supplies, waiting for the controls to collapse. Remember the question from the beginning? Why does food insecurity destroy empires faster than military defeat? Here's the partial answer. Because food crises attack the empire's credibility, not just its resources. When Spain's armies lost battles, Philip could borrow money, rebuild, and fight again. His credit was good because the silver fleets kept arriving from Potosi. But when bread prices tripled, peasants couldn't pay taxes. Municipalities couldn't collect revenue, and suddenly the gap between Spain's military commitments and its actual income became impossible to hide. In 1596, Philip II declared bankruptcy. Not because Spain was out of silver, the fleets still arrived, but because the internal economy had collapsed. Tax collection fell by an estimated 40% in Castile between 1590 and 1598. The crown tried to keep fighting the war in the Netherlands anyway. They borrowed at higher interest rates. They debased the currency. They squeezed the peasantry harder. And the peasantry left. Demographic records show Castile lost approximately 25% of its rural population between 1590 and 1620, through death, migration, and simply abandoning villages. By 1610, Spain signed a 12-year truce with the Dutch, effective independence for the Netherlands. The Spanish Empire continued in name for another century, but the peak had passed. From harvest failures to strategic retreat, 16 years. Now, stay with me here, because we're about to see the same pattern play out in the 20th century, with tractors instead of oxen. But the mechanism? Identical. 1970. The Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower, second largest economy on Earth, and it couldn't feed itself. This wasn't supposed to happen. Soviet agricultural policy had been designed specifically to prevent this. Collectivized farms, mechanized production, central planning. On paper, the USSR had more arable land than the United States. On paper. In reality, Soviet grain yields per hectare were roughly half of American levels. Collective farms had no incentive to innovate. Equipment broke down and stayed broken. Fertilizer allocation was a political decision, not an agronomic one. And the weather didn't care about 5-year plans. 1972. Drought across Ukraine and the Volga region. Soviet grain production fell from 181 million tons in 1971 to 168 million. The shortfall forced the USSR to import 23 million tons, the largest grain purchase in history up to that point. They bought it from the United States, paid in hard currency, dollars and gold. The purchase drained Soviet reserves and drove up global grain prices by 50%. The Soviets had one advantage the Mughals and Spanish didn't. They could import grain. Lots of it. They had oil revenue. Brezhnev's government decided that maintaining urban food supplies, keeping bread cheap in Moscow and Leningrad, was worth any cost. so they kept buying. 1975, 15.5 million tons imported. 1979, 31 million tons. 1984, 46 million tons. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was spending approximately $15 billion annually on grain imports, roughly 10% of total export earnings. The USSR had become dependent on its geopolitical rival for basic food security. Let that settle in. The second superpower, nuclear arsenal, space program, military presence on 4 continents, couldn't survive without American wheat. And everyone knew it. Western policymakers understood that grain exports gave them leverage. When the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979, President Carter's first response wasn't military. It was an embargo on grain sales. The embargo failed. Other countries filled the gap. But the message was clear. Soviet power rested on a foundation that could be cut off at any moment. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev admitted publicly that Soviet agriculture was in crisis. He tried reforms, allowing limited private plots, reducing central planning. Too little, too late. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. Multiple causes, obviously. But trace the timeline. From the first major grain imports in 1972 to collapse in 1991. 19 years. The pattern held. 3 empires, 3 centuries, 1 pattern. Agricultural crisis. Elite denial or inadequate response. Cascading economic failure. Collapse within 2 decades. So here's the question that should be keeping us awake. Are we watching the same pattern unfold right now? Let's look at the current data, not speculation, documented fact. Global grain reserves as a percentage of annual consumption. In 2000, reserves covered approximately 107 days of global consumption. By 2022, that number had fallen to 79 days. We're eating closer to the edge than we have in 50 years. Climate stress on agriculture. The 2023 IPCC report documents that heat extremes have reduced global agricultural productivity growth by 21% since 1961. That's not a future projection. That's already happened. In 2022, India banned wheat exports after a heat wave reduced yields by 15%. Pakistan's floods destroyed 45% of crops in Sindh province. China's grain imports hit 164 million tons, a 19% increase over 2021. The 3 largest populations on Earth are all experiencing simultaneous agricultural stress. But here's where it gets strange. Because we're not facing the same type of crisis as the Mughals or the Soviets. We have better technology, more resilient supply chains, global trade networks. What we have now is more dangerous because it looks so efficient. A global food system that runs on razor-thin margins and just-in-time delivery. Modern food systems are optimized for cost, not resilience. Just-in-time delivery, minimal stockpiles, concentrated production in a handful of breadbasket regions. When COVID-19 disrupted logistics in 2020, food banks in wealthy countries ran out of supplies within weeks, not because food didn't exist, but because distribution networks couldn't adapt. And the geopolitical dependencies are worse than the Soviet case. Russia and Ukraine together exported 25% of global wheat before February 2022. That percentage fed North Africa and the Middle East, regions with minimal grain reserves. When the war started, wheat prices jumped 50% in 3 months. Egypt, which imports 80% of its wheat, faced immediate crisis. Lebanon's government nearly collapsed. This isn't about predicting collapse. It's about recognizing the warning signs while there's still time to respond. The Mughals had 18 years. They spent it fighting wars in the Deccan. Spain had 16 years. They spent it trying to maintain an empire they could no longer afford. The Soviets had 19 years. They spent it pretending the problem didn't exist. We've had the data since at least 2010. We know climate change is reducing agricultural productivity. We know supply chains are fragile. We know geopolitical tensions can cut off food supplies overnight. The question isn't whether we've been warned. The question is whether we'll be the first civilization to actually listen. 11%. That's what it took to bring down the French monarchy in 1789. The distance between a functioning society and total collapse? smaller than you think. And the pattern keeps repeating because the mechanism underneath stays the same. Empires fall when they lose the ability to feed their populations. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The warning signs are already visible. What we do with them is still our choice. If this pattern holds, the next question becomes obvious. What happens to global stability when multiple agricultural systems fail simultaneously? We're examining that scenario in the next investigation, the cascading effects of synchronized food crises across interconnected economies. The historical precedent might surprise you. That video drops next week. Every collapse has a story. Let's investigate.